So, what do we know? Well, they do these standardized tests all the time now. The United States ranks 30th in the world in math. 30th. We used to be number one. In the 60s, the United States was number one. Our students came out of school with the best math skills in the world. And we put people on the moon, and we did all this exciting stuff, and now we're 30th in math. And we're 8th in reading, and we're 11th in science. Okay? And we've had big effort for the last 20 years to improve our numbers, and basically we haven't improved our numbers. And the reason that we haven't improved our numbers is simple. The United States has, for all the developed countries in the world, a huge gap between the top of our distribution and the bottom of that distribution. And what I mean by that is if we look at the socioeconomic background of people in school, the higher you are, your family is on the socioeconomic background, the better people do in school. We don't have an equal education system that spreads across everybody in our country. We have much better schools depending on your income. And if you look at, I don't know if you've ever been out to high schools in Las Vegas, but I go to high schools in Las Vegas all the time because, well, not anymore, but I used to go to high schools in Las Vegas all the time, and hopefully I'll do it again because I referee volleyball and I referee basketball and I'm out in the schools. And what you see is schools in certain neighborhoods that they're clean and they're beautiful, and there's all this academic stuff going around. As you just walk through the school to get to the gym, you can see that there's science stuff and and then there's other schools you go to and they're more like prisons, and everything's locked down, and you got to go through here, and then they don't let people, and then a lot of the schools in town seem to be more warehouses where they're just babysitting all day, and a lot of the other schools in town seem to be much more focused on student achievement. Just saying. Okay? And we actually know that school size has a big predictor of how good the school is, that the smaller the school is, the better on average it does. And so the fact that in Las Vegas we build these schools that hold 2,000 or 3,000 students is a sign that we're not that committed to quality education. Okay? You want to go to a smaller size school, not a bigger size school, to really learn effectively. Okay? Which is why a lot of the high schools in town now have these academies that they get students in, where it's a smaller, more focused group of students within the giant high school. Anyway, we could talk about this for a long time. Economics of education is a big deal. Economists study this all the time. But the numbers in the United States are not supportive of the idea that we can maintain just by ourselves our leadership in the world in terms of patents and innovations and inventions and all that. Okay? Turns out that half of all of the billion-dollar corporations that have been created in the United States in the last 15 years have an immigrant as one of the founders. Okay, so you look at Google, it's one U.S. citizen, one non-U.S. citizen that founded Google, right? They lived in the same dorm at Stanford. Okay, so if you look at the last 15 years, the billion-dollar plus companies that have been founded, half of them have immigrants as either founders or one of the founders. Okay? And that's, again, perhaps a sign of the way that the United States is, but we've always been that way, right? Andrew Carnegie came to the United States. He was an immigrant, and when he died, he was the richest person on earth. Okay? So the United States, the land of opportunity, all this stuff, maybe, hopefully, is still true. And we can overcome the fact that our education system is pretty bad relative to a lot of the other developed countries in the world. But anyway, you have to work on that. Get with it. Get your generation going. Fix education. All right, so the two best examples in the world of economic growth over the last 70 years are Japan and South Korea. The end of World War II, Japan is one of the poorest countries in the world. The end of the Korean War, Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world. The GDP per capita in South Korea at the end of the Korean War was something like $64 a person. It was a very poor country. Both of those countries are now among the richest countries in the world. And how did that happen? Well, it didn't necessarily happen because of either theory. Okay? It happened because they did a whole bunch of things. One of the things that both countries did, in China they call, or China, in South Korea they call them chaebol, in Japan they call them zaibatsu. The government put together conglomerates of corporations. So in Japan there's a number of these zaibatsus. In South Korea there's a number of these chaebols, and they're large conglomerate corporations where you have a steel company and an automobile company and a bank and a electronics company, and they all work together. Okay? We don't actually allow that in the United States. That would be all violations of the antitrust laws. But the government decided, let me be clear, that in both these countries the government decided what they were going to be good at. And there's a gentleman named Park over here on the left-hand side. He led a coup that took over South Korea in the early military coup that took over South Korea early in the 1960s. And he simply decided what the country was going to do, how it was going to do it. He was not the nicest person in the world, and there wasn't a lot of democracy and freedom in Korea. But in both Japan and South Korea, the United States gave both those countries a lot of money. So the United States gave Japan a lot of money at the end of World War II and gave South Korea a bunch of money at the end of Korean War. Both of those countries invested heavily in their education system so that their populations are highly educated. And they picked particular industries that they wanted to be good at, whether it's the steel industry or the car industry or electronics or whatever. They targeted certain industries. The government forced companies to do things a certain way to target those industries. The countries controlled trade so that they prevented foreign competition from interfering with those industries as they grew. They limited imports. They pushed and subsidized exports. They did all these things that resulted in their countries growing and being highly successful. But neither one of these experiences necessarily follows either of the theories of what it takes to grow. This was very guided growth. Now, again, they did a lot of effort into the education systems and concentrated on particular industries, and they were producing very efficient and very highly skilled, right? Japan, electronics in Japan, cars from Japan, steel and cars from South Korea, okay? It was very directed, controlled, but there is this element of strong emphasis on education, okay? And in some measure of innovation and being at the cutting edge of the technology of how they produce. Okay? And even today, South Korea has the fastest average internet speeds, broadband speeds of any country in the world. So they're staying out there on the edge in many ways. Okay? But it's not as simple as they saved a lot or they invented a bunch of stuff. The answer to how those two countries grew is much more complex. They had outside help. They had very strict governmental ideas of where they were going, and the government pushed them in a certain way and controlled businesses and told them what to do. And then they had the education and all that. Okay? So it's a complex story that neither one of those two theories is just the simple idea of what you do. If we invent a lot of times now in the United States, we invent something new, but then we ship it off to China to be built, and therefore the technology gets transferred to China or Korea or wherever we sent the technology to be employed. So Apple invents stuff in the United States, but then their factories are in China and Taiwan. And okay, so there's this global spread of technology in a different way. It's, again, very complex world. Right? We have the coronavirus. We invent all these drugs in the United States, where by far like 90% of all the new drugs that are invented in the United States are invented in the United States. There are drugs that are invented in Japan and China and Europe that we don't allow into the United States. We only allow the drugs that are invented here, which is probably a problem for us. And then at the same time, our drugs are all manufactured in China. So, if 95% of the antibiotics sold in the United States are manufactured in China, or the base ingredients for those antibiotics come from countries like China and India, then we're transferring this technology of these drugs that we create out into the rest of the world. And it's a question. Okay. Does it matter if you have natural resources? So lots of people seem to think that growth should be based on the fact that you have natural resources. And they might use Saudi Arabia as an example, that Saudi Arabia was a very poor country and now it's a very rich country because it had oil. Okay, and up here on the wall I have cobalt and uranium and oil as examples for you. And the answer is yes and no. And probably more no than yes. So China has some natural resources, but it's not huge. Japan has no natural resources, hardly at all. The United States has lots of natural resources. Nigeria has everything. Nigeria has oil and cobalt and uranium and diamonds and you name it, gold, you name it, they got it. And yet that does not guarantee that their country does well. In fact, if your country is too dependent on natural resources, you have problems with growing, because as the price of those natural resources goes up and down, your economy goes up and down, and bad things happen to you every time it goes down, and you might have social unrest because now you were doing all these things and you can't afford to do them anymore. Right? Saudi Arabia, the OPEC countries have controlled the price of oil, so they haven't had huge swings. Now they're having a huge swing, but they have the financial wherewithal to survive that, and it only costs them about $6 a barrel to make oil in Saudi Arabia, where it costs $10 or $12 in Russia and $30 a barrel in the United States to pull oil out of the ground. So they have a huge advantage over everybody else, and if they're careful, they can continue to control that market for a long time. I put cobalt up here because even though most of the cobalt in the world is mined in Africa, the mines are generally owned by the Chinese now. So the Chinese have bought up 80-something% of all the cobalt mines in the world, and most of those mines, again, are in Africa. So those African nations, they have the natural resource, but the real benefit from that natural resource is going to accrue to China, not to them. Okay? Nevada, might have already talked about this. Nevada's full of gold mines, and yet those gold mines are owned by companies outside the United States. So the profits that are earned out of those gold mines don't end up here in Nevada, or they don't end up in the United States. They end up somewhere out elsewhere on the planet Earth. So the whole natural resource thing is complex, but it's hard to find a country on the planet Earth that got rich because it had natural resources other than the oil-producing countries. And they got rich not because the price of oil naturally went up, but because they got together and made it go up. If Saudi Arabia can produce oil for $6 a barrel, there's no reason that oil shouldn't be half what it is. The gasoline prices shouldn't be $1 a gallon still. A couple dollars a gallon, maybe, at most. Okay? But the oil-producing countries got together, they can control the price of oil, and that's why the price is so high. All right, it's a monopoly kind of thing.